This is the Red Podcast.
It's Red Podcast, the marketing podcast for experts. If you've got a book, if you've got a podcast, if you've got 2 tin cans and a string, you've got a message and you want to get it out, however you want to do it, this is the podcast that's going to help you do that. I'm David Hooper, your host. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you may remember my wife,
Laurel Staples on Red Podcast.
She started it with me. This podcast wasn't for me. She was working on a project. She needed to build an audience. I took it over, but her impact on this podcast remains. Definitely with this episode. She was in a mastermind group about that time with a guy named Nick Loper. I'm not sure how she connected with him initially, but I met him at an event in Las Vegas. Sometimes you'll be at these events, especially in something like Las Vegas. There are a lot of flashy people in the world. A lot of businessmen, a lot of gamblers. A lot of people are full of themselves. They believe their own press. They project a lot of hype. That is not Nick Loper. Nick is a really solid, down-to-earth guy. He's a great combination of grounded, humble, and successful. If you're not familiar with the work that he does, he has a podcast and also a site called Side Hustle Nation. And I brought him on here for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a great behind-the-scenes look at an expert business. We talk about how he got started. Like a lot of people, kind of just fell into it. But when he saw the opportunity, he ran with it. As we talk about his business, there's some other stories that are sprinkled in. I think you will also find those inspiring. Some of those people are making money with their expert knowledge. Some of them, it's good old-fashioned hard work. But I love this kind of stuff. Let me give you another story about my wife. A few days ago, and I'm not sure why we pulled it up, but there's a website. It's called Flippa, F-L-I-P-P-A, like the dolphin. You might remember that TV show. Flippa.com. Neither one of us was looking for anything in particular, but there's something about getting on a site like that when you see how other people are doing things, whether it's graphic design or web hosting or e-commerce, a certain aspect of their businesses, or maybe you see a business that you didn't know existed. There's something about that that's really inspiring if you're able to translate that to your business. Flippa is interesting to me because a lot of the business are these little bitty sites that make just a little bit of money every month, but they do it consistently. And if you've got a site, let's say maybe $3,000, not what some people would consider a lot of money, but if you've got a few of those, or if you've got one that's doing $3,000 consistently month after month after month, that's not bad. It adds up. And that's a lot of what Nick does at Side Hustle Nation. The work, it's not very sexy, but it's good, solid work, and it's consistent. It's easy to get caught up in what I call Niagara Falls money, where you think there's going to be this huge rush of money coming in. Oh, I'm making $100,000 a month. I'm making $200,000 a month. And there are a lot of guys that promote that, usually when they're selling make money information. Is it possible? Yes. Can you do it? Yes. But there's also that back door, maybe even a side door. Just kind of sneak your way in there, where you can do $3,000 a month consistently. And if you do it once, you can do it twice. Pretty easy to set up. And it's a nice thing to have on the side. There's a great saying, live by leverage, die by leverage. And we have definitely seen that over the last few months here in the United States, here in the world. You got people making big money, and then they're not. I know a lot of musicians, for example. They were getting ready to go out on the road. They had these big tours scheduled. Everything was set up. Tickets already sold. Coronavirus hits, bam, it's off the table. The same thing for speakers. I know a lot of authors that were affected by this, book launches that were delayed. It's great to have those big income streams when you can get them, but you live by leverage, you die by leverage. A lot of the guys I know who are doing the best right now, they had these little bitty things going. You wouldn't pay much attention to them, but they're keeping themselves afloat until the economy bounces back. We start going to live shows, things get back to normal. The other reason I wanted to have Nick on this episode is because Nick does things his way. Like I said, he's a very solid, down-to-earth guy, not flashy, and he has built a business around his personality. He's not a guy that you're going to see on YouTube every day yelling at the camera. Yeah, I'm making $100,000, $200,000 a month. Yay, me. Buy my stuff. It's only $2,000. But if you buy it now, I'll add on the package and you'll get it for $1,000. He's not one of those guys. He does things his way. We talk about how he built his business around those strengths that he has and did it in a way that works for him. That's really important if you want to have longevity. Way too often we see something working for somebody else, like the $100,000 or $200,000 a month guys. And we think, oh man, I wish I could do that. But then we try it and it doesn't work for us. Why not? It's not always because you're doing it wrong. It could be that you're not doing it in a way that works for you. I think you're going to find this very inspiring. So without further ado, this is Nick Loper from Side Hustle Nation. You're one of those guys that I love to talk to because you eat your own cooking, meaning what you talk about, you have done it. I want you to tell me about the background of Side Hustle Nation, because at one time you had a side hustle and that's how this thing all started.
That's right. Well, on top of that, I definitely eat plenty of cookies, so there's probably a diet tip in there somewhere too. The Side Hustle show was started as a side project from my original side hustle, which had turned into a full-time thing. That was a comparison shoe shopping website. Like, where can you find the best deal on your next pair of shoes kind of a deal. And that was the vehicle that let me quit my job. So it was 3 years of nights and weekends side hustling to make that dream a reality, like escape the rat race and go sell shoes online full time. And the site would make money from Zappos and Amazon and like all these other online shoe stores. They would pay commission for any sales that were generated through the site. So I was running that. And like 4 or 5 years into doing that, because I naively thought like, this could be my thing. Like I can just do this forever. But there was like this soul searching moment of like, what do you want to be known for when people Google you? Like, what do you never get tired about talking about? And like this concept of this lower risk brand of entrepreneurship. This like, hey, start something small, start something on the side, start something low risk and build that up as you have time to do it. Because the entrepreneurial narrative that I was hearing at the time was like the Silicon Valley, you're going to go raise venture capital. An entrepreneur is the person who jumps off a cliff and figures out how to build his parachute on the way down. Like, that sounds terrifying to me. Like, I think the side hustle method is a lot more attainable for the vast majority of people who are looking to get something started.
You're playing with your own money. And what I have noticed from people that I work with that are in the venture capital space or the startup space, they really aren't respectful of money. And they have no idea where it comes from or how it's made. They're just thinking about funding. I asked a guy one time, I said, how do you know when it's time to throw in the towel? And he's like, yeah, when I can't get any more funding. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that's all I need to know about you. It's a different world for the rest of us that are playing with our own money. I want to talk about that because you told me something. We'd done an interview for my blog, Big Podcast Bulletin, about starting a podcast. And it sounded like you were very frugal when you first started. And the quote you gave me was, you said, well, I got podcast hosting for $15 a month. And had it been 25 or 30, I probably wouldn't have done this. Let's talk about your philosophy toward building a business and spending money and what you invest your time and money in.
Yeah, everything has been bootstrapped. I mean, I think the most expensive startup that I ever had was $3,000 for a painting business. And that was just because I bought a truck. Everything had to be super lean, and I still have kind of a phobia of spending money if I don't see a return on it or if I don't have the revenue to justify it. And that was kind of the thing. Like, the podcast was such a speculative thing, whereas like, yeah, had it been $30 a month for hosting, is like, and you got to pay that for however long you want the show to exist. Like, what am I committing myself to? What am I signing myself up for? And at that time, it was like, yeah, a weekly show. Am I going to run out of guests? Am I, going to run out of stuff to talk about? And of course, people were doing daily podcasts. Like, okay, there's no shortage of entrepreneurs who want to share their story. But it's been 6.5 years and have not run out of guests yet. So I don't see that being a problem anymore. And thankfully, that $15 a month is like, it's like, that's an incredibly low startup cost given the power of podcasting. So it's like $50 mic, studio in my living room, and $15 a month for hosting to like be able to broadcast to reach thousands and thousands of people. Of course, not at the beginning, but like, worldwide audience. Like, it's been a life-changing thing.
I will give you an example of what radio costs, because I have a syndicated show. We do it via broadcast radio, and just the license for the flagship station, which is in Nashville, $20 million. That's just a piece of paper that says you can do this. That doesn't include the tower, the electricity, the staffing, the equipment. I don't know that people really appreciate what we've got in podcasting. When you've got a $15 mic, you've got a laptop that you probably already had, and $15 a month to host the thing. It's an amazing return on investment, to take it back to that.
Yeah.
You're a blogger first.
That's kind of shifted a little bit at the beginning, because I've been blogging at a personal domain, nickloper.com, for several years. That was a cool creative outlet that was helpful to learn WordPress and, creating content for the internet. But nobody ever read it, because there was no coherent or consistent theme to the site. It was like, here's pictures from our last vacation, or here's some rant about current events. There was no defined focus to the site. I was kind of surprised upon, rebranding, say, okay, I'm going to focus on the side hustle stuff, kind of spring, summer 2013, and shifted the writing, and then started the podcast at that same time. But within the first year, both sides of the content audience had grown, but the podcast had grown, I think, 3 or 4 times faster. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. I don't know if it was just like less competitive or what it was, the compelling stories. Like, it wasn't just me, like, other people were, sharing their advice. I don't know what it was, but the podcast definitely kind of started to get more traction. And so adjusted accordingly to spend more of my effort and energy and attention on that.
What do you think it is, other than the clarity of message, that allowed you to have this kind of growth? How much of it do you think was timing?
Timing is always helpful. And I mean, in 2013, it still felt like a crowded field. Like, I should have started in 2009,
Right.
And I think if you're listening now and you're like, well, should I get in? Is it too crowded? Like, think about what it's going to look like 6 years from now. I think the biggest shift in the podcasting space specifically is the entrance of big media. And so now you see a whole host of NPR shows and New York Times shows and ESPN shows, and like these well-funded, they got 14 people like on this production staff, where it's like, you're not going to be able to compete with that on a production level as a solo podcaster. So you kind of have to compete with the compelling content side of things. So like, okay, what's the unique angle, story, value that we're going to bring to the airwaves if it's not going to be this highly produced show?
Well, that's the thing I was talking about with the guys that are in the VC market and working on other people's money. This is the media for the rest of us, and there's an opportunity for us to better connect with people because of that. People can relate to, I've got $3,000, let's buy a truck, or let's put up a site and sell shoes that we don't even have to stock. We can outsource all that. I do think people can connect, but yeah, I do wonder about timing all the time. All the time. I think you're exactly right. When we look back 5 or 6 years ago, if you think about your life, you're like, well, life was simpler back then, and we didn't have as many problems then as we have now. I think that's maybe just human nature, and it certainly applies to podcasting.
Yeah, it's like, the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. Well, you missed that boat, so you might as well start now. Or a year from now, you're going to wish that you started today.
Yeah, second best time today.
Yeah, like the term side hustle was obviously part of the lexicon at that time. Like, I didn't invent it. I feel like it's become more commonplace over the last 6 years. Interestingly, like the biggest spike, like if you look at the Google Trends, it's kind of on this slow and steady climb. It was when Chris Guillebeau from $100 Startup and World Domination Summit, and now his book Side Hustle, it was when he launched the Side Hustle School podcast, where you really see the big blip on the Google Trends chart for the term side hustle. And of course, having been already doing this for 3.5 years at that point, I was well positioned to capitalize on that, because I ranked number 1 in iTunes and Google and all this stuff for that term. A rising tide can lift all boats. The only downside is I need more New York Times bestselling authors to come into this space.
Well, I know sidehustlenation.com is the website, but that was not available as far as the open market. You had to go to the aftermarket. Can you talk about that and your decision to purchase that domain rather than go for other domains? Because I know a lot of people, they're really scared about spending any more than $8 or $10 or whatever the open name market lets them have this. Oh no, and they go with a name that maybe is let's call it second best, or something that might not connect as well. Talk about the name and why you chose Side Hustle Nation, and why you chose to actually invest a little bit more than the $8 or $10 that some people would only invest.
That was just kind of the name that stuck out in my head for what I kind of envisioned this to be called, whereas like, kind of had this vision of a community type of thing. It's like, okay, this is my buddy is like Oakland Raiders fan. And so he's like Raider Nation, right? So I was like, oh, Side Hustle Nation. So I found this site and it had some content on it, but it hadn't been updated in a while. And so I just reached out to the owner, and you can look this up, like whois.org or something, just look up like look up to figure out who the domain owner is. Sometimes it's privately registered, and in which case your odds of reaching somebody are probably less likely, but you'll send through like a proxy email address, and GoDaddy or whoever will forward it to the owner. But in this case, I don't think it was privately registered. So I sent out like, hey, notice you haven't been updating this site in a while. I'd like to take it off your hands if you're interested. How do you feel about $100? Because I feel like a lot of domain owners get lowball offers all the time, or they have an inflated sense of what this domain might be worth. But thankfully, this person understood like, hey, here's an asset that I have. It's not worth anything because I'm not doing anything with it. It doesn't get any traffic. Let's make this deal. And I've only done that a handful of times. Like, that's one of the more expensive domains that I've ever bought. I think I bought startmysidehustle.com this summer from another third party, and that was like $250 or something, which was like way more than I would ever spend on a domain before.
Let's talk about the community, because when I go to sidehustlenation.com, obviously there's the name that kind of cues me into what's going on. But I think a lot of people, it just sounds like a cool name and they don't back it up with community. But when I look at the episodes that you're doing, you're sharing examples that other people have done this to. And what's interesting about the examples is, like, one of them was about repairing fish tanks or something. I was like, oh my gosh, they're so unique, but you do feel like you're part of something. Are you doing anything to maybe engage that community or encourage that community to talk, communicate with each other? Let's talk about how you've built it and how thought out that was, or did it just happen?
It's kind of funny. The best episodes or the best performing episodes, like almost universally kind of bubble up from within the community. Like, people will reach out to me from the email list, like, hey, I've been listening to you for years. I think I have something that might be compelling. And that's how Larry, the fish tank guy, got on the show. It's like, hey, this is random, got to mix in these blue collar ones for all these online stuff.
It's so quirky though, right? It's like we're all into this sexy kind of .com thing, and I've got this cool name that nobody can pronounce. We dropped a vowel and added an R to the end.
Right.
And when you say fish, that seems simple. Like, it's like I can understand, I can wrap my brain around that business.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it, but I think it just makes it seem like it's possible,
Yeah, I mean, we had a guy whose business was picking up trash from parking lots. He turned that into a $600,000 a year operation. We had a guy renting out bounce houses. We had a guy, his whole business was like flipping industrial shipping byproducts like pallets. And he's like, so what you do is you go on Google Earth, like to the industrial parts of your town, and if you see a bunch of pallets out behind a warehouse, that's a prospect. They're either a buyer or a supplier. And he just had this whole thing. It's like the starter question was like, what do y'all do with those pallets? And he just kind of built this database over the course of 20 years. Like, there's a million ways to get it done. Back to the community aspect of it. So the primary community hub for me is a Facebook group, which is Side Hustle Nation group on Facebook. It's 16,000 people strong at this point. It's grown pretty slowly, intentionally, in a lot of ways. Trying to draw people from the podcast, from the website, from the email list first, rather than like from Facebook search. But inside that group, I mean, it's been really rewarding to see the conversations that are happening without my direct involvement, people asking and answering questions, finding leads and supporting each other. That's kind of become the hub. And so I start to see questions. So it's been a source of content, for one, like the questions that people ask, like, okay, I can turn that into Q&A stuff. Secondly, I see people doing interesting things and sharing that, like, hey, that might be interesting to talk about on the show. For a source of like a Roundup style stuff, what would you do in this scenario? Like, fill in the blank, and like you get a bunch of cool suggestions. Like, I had one email where I didn't really know how to answer this. The guy kind of shared he was in not a great situation, and he's like, I'm broke, I'm depressed, like I live in the projects, like I don't know what to do. I put that out to the group and got dozens and dozens of like real, legit, actionable suggestions. And so I was like, hey, I didn't know how to respond to you. Hope it's okay. I made you anonymous, but like, here's what hive mind or the group, this is what they suggested. So hopefully that was helpful for him too.
I love that. I feel like that's how you know you have a good group, when the group, one, starts talking to each other, but two, gets your philosophy where they can spread it for you. We see that with some radio hosts, some gurus that are out there spreading a message, and they say, well, what would Tony Robbins do? Well, he would say this, bling, bling, bling. And that's how Tony grows it. That's his marketing. He doesn't have to market as hard because of that. So that's certainly a great way to grow it. As far as you putting yourself out there, though, I do want to make sure that we talk about that, because one of the things I think that keeps people from doing what you have done is because you get the credit and you have to take the responsibility. It's very scary. Can you talk about that? Because you and I have met a few times. You appear to be an introvert just from kind of hanging out with you. You're not flashy. You're not boisterous. You're a guy who seems to just do the work. And I've noticed that with a lot of people who are successful like you are. They're not flashy. They do the work. It's the opposite of what most people would think.
Yeah, it's trying to, like, we have a shirt that says, like, stay humble, hustle hard. Kind of like, don't let it go to your head if there is anything to go to your head. I don't know. This was a hesitation, and probably one of the reasons I didn't start the site and the podcast earlier was like that fear of putting yourself out there and saying, okay, I am going to be the go-to guy for this topic area. And it's like, that's kind of a scary thing to be, because it's like I had all these fears, like, oh, my friends are going to be like, come on, man, you're not that successful. You're not that smart. Like, who are you to talk about this stuff? And like, those were real fears that went through my head. And I see that, preventing people from getting started today. Fear of putting yourself out there is very real.
Have you noticed a downside to that? Do you have critics and people like, oh, this is, I don't even know what they would say. I mean, how you hate on somebody who's trying to help other people make money in such an earnest way, but yet here we are. If you do those videos, if you've ever put up something on YouTube, that's the cesspool. It's like the worst part of humanity, it seems, as far as criticism and things. Yeah,
I mean, everybody gets their share, and it's kind of like a badge of honor, right? Like, you've made it when you got your first hater. I have a folder in Gmail called Hate Mail, which thankfully doesn't have a ton of stuff in it. And usually it's responses like to my newsletter, where they have more than enough time on their hands to not just click the unsubscribe button. They really just want to tell you how they feel. It's like, all right, you're having a rough day. Fine. You kind of shake it off. What used to bother me way more was like getting 1-star reviews on my work. Like, I put books up on Amazon and get like these 1-star ratings. And I'm like, oh, it just like ruined my weekend. And now you're like, well, at least somebody saw it. It's a hard thing to deal with.
Well, they used to say this when I was in the music industry. People talk about burning records or burning books. Like, well, they've already bought it, so they can do whatever they want with it. But like, what kind of problems do people have with things like your books or your podcast? Why would somebody give you a 1-star review?
I don't know. I mean, it's usually an internal critique, and sometimes it's like, well, there's a piece of that that's valid. So I take that back to the drawing board. Anytime you're kind of in this make money online space, entrepreneurship space. And this is something I was, honestly kind of skeptical of or fearful of becoming myself, like the guy who makes money online, telling other people how to make money online. Like, it's a weird, a weird place to be in. And you're kind of like, that's the old joke in online marketing. People are inherently skeptical, which is awesome. They should be, because there are kind of a ton of scams and gurus and everything else out there. But when you approach everything with skepticism and you don't have an open enough mind to say like, oh no, this could work for me, and here's how it can. Like, why are you even paying attention to this stuff? Just go back to work.
Are you still doing the side hustles at all, or have you moved strictly into media and kind of curating this and organizing the community?
I've been slacking on my side hustle experiments lately as the show has kind of become the main focus. Like, early on, that was my idea behind the site. Like, oh, I'll test out all these different things. Like, I'll be the guinea pig, I'll be the reporter, and come back and tell you how it all worked. Like, okay, I'll start selling stuff on Fiverr. I'll start selling stuff on eBay and Amazon, and I'll tell you how it works. Did a little bit of that. So I still have an affiliate site that I run. It's a virtual assistant directory. That's kind of the biggest side hustle at the moment. So that started actually in 2011. So it predates Side Hustle Nation. The other one that we've been playing around with is like merch by Amazon. So I don't know if you ever did this, but it's like print on demand through Amazon. It started out with t-shirts and now they've got a ton of different products. But it's awesome. You just upload your design, like come up with a clever t-shirt saying, upload your design, Amazon prints it, ships it, fulfills it, Prime eligible. It's a very low overhead side hustle, which has been pretty fun the last couple of years.
You mentioned these experiments that you've had, and I know bloggers like Pat Flynn have had real luck with sharing income and being what they would call transparent with what's happening behind the scenes. Let's talk about the transparency that you've had in your business. Did you share income? I mean, how open did you get as far as watching the sausage get made and letting other people watch that?
Yeah, I never did full monthly income reports like Pat kind of paved the trail for that level of transparency. I actually, interestingly, had one written up a couple years deep into the site and sent it to some peers, sent it to some mastermind groups. And it was kind of a split decision on like, should I publish this? You know, ultimately is like, what benefit would come from that? Like, so kind of pulled the plug on that. But instead have posted income reports like for specific projects. Like, hey, I launched a course on Udemy. Here's how much it made in the first 60 days. Here's everything I did to launch it. Here's, the 12-month income report for this book project. Here's the 7 or 8 different income streams that this single book generated. I've done stuff like that rather than like, here's the full monthly picture.
I think that's a good balance. I know a lot of people have struggled with it because in some ways I feel like it's an easy way to get traffic because of the spectacle and people are so curious about it. But it does seem that there becomes a time when it turns on you, especially the more successful you become. And we were just talking about haters and critics and things where people don't believe it, people think you're faking it, or you get just to the point where people can't connect with it because there is so much money coming in. I think Pat, certainly, it was that way for him. When you're getting to bring in, I don't know, $100,000, $200,000 per month, there's something in a lot of people's minds. They're like, that's good for him, but that ain't working for me.
Yeah, and it's just like, does it make things weird with your friends and family? Like, it's kind of a weird place to be to publicly broadcast that. And that's one reason I think you've seen Pat kind of turn those off in the last year or two. And same with Michelle from Making Sense of Sense. It's like, you're over this $100,000 mark, which is like awesome to see what's possible, but probably not so relatable to the people you're trying to serve.
Beyonce gets paid $20 million for a bar mitzvah.
Nice.
That's a good gig, but it ain't happening for you. The average musician's not going to relate to it. I want to talk about the guests that you have because I mentioned you've got 20 million. I'm sorry, speaking of, I'm inflating you. That's coming up. 10 million for now downloads of your podcast. And I think one of the ways that you grow a podcast is having great content. Let's talk about how you vet your guests. Do you have restrictions on the type of guests that you bring in? Like they can talk about this, but they can't talk about that, for example?
So I start every episode with the hook of like, what is the listener going to get out of this? What's the transformation? What are they going to learn? Like, why is this compelling radio? Why should I tune into this? And starting with that, rather than, trying to get some famous guest to talk about their latest book, then that has helped me, I think, craft a better show. For example, like the parking lot pickup guy, his hook was like, if you can walk, you can make money. Like, this is the simplest side hustle ever, right? And so people may not have considered picking up trash as a side business before tuning in, but with that hook, they're like, okay, hey, this has to be done before work because the cars aren't in the parking lot. It's a perfect side hustle. Here's how you contact property management companies. So starting with that in mind, that's been really helpful to kind of structure the show. And then I build kind of an outline or story arc of like where I anticipate this going. And of course, like any conversation, there's follow-up questions. You kind of leave fluidity to it. And then through the magic of editing, you can make things sound pretty good.
What kind of guests do you turn down? I imagine you get a lot of pitches from people who want to be on this podcast.
Typically, the pitches that get turned down or don't even get a response are the ones that come from PR companies. Usually they're not personalized at all. Normally it's so-and-so has a 7-figure business and they are coming out with a new book. Like, okay, that's probably beyond the level that my audience is at. Great for him. Like, that's fantastic, but not super relevant. The other pitches, like usually it's like, oh, this 23-year-old has 18 software companies and had an 8-figure exit. Like, again, great for you, like not necessarily relevant for side hustlers. So that's kind of the check boxes that I look for, is like repeatable, relatable, low startup cost, low barrier to entry. Like if something in that sweet spot tends to do pretty well. And on top of that, like if you're in the position to afford a PR company to go out and pitch these on your behalf, like that's probably not a great fit, because like you're kind of beyond that bootstrap level. One of the interesting pitches that I got was from Brian Scudamore. Like he's the founder, CEO of 1-800-GOT-JUNK. The entire company is built on PR, right? But instead he sent me a pitch directly, at least, you know, it appeared to be from his email address. And we had a little bit of back and forth talking about what makes a good pitch. And so it's like, this junk hauling business definitely checks a box of being relatable, repeatable, and low startup costs. He started with like a $700 pickup truck. So he ended up getting on the show. And he's going to he went from that $700 pickup truck to doing $1 million a day through franchising on 1-800-GOT-JUNK. Like just insane growth over the last 25 years.
Do you ever pull the plug on interviews? Like you get into the middle of one and you're like, oh, this is a horrible mistake. I mean, how do you handle when you think it's going to be good, but you know, and then you got the guests that are like, hey, when are you going to release that, Nick? How'd that go?
Yeah, it's so much better to keep it awkward between two people than between thousands. And there have been probably less than a dozen of ones where you've had to pull the plug and say like, that just didn't do it for me. Sometimes you cut it off mid-call and say like, hey, this isn't working. And sometimes like we'll regroup and say like, we need to narrow our focus. We need to narrow our story arc. We're trying to cover, 10 years of history. It's just not working. Like, let's focus on like this particular tactic that worked for you. So that's been a way to salvage a few of them. Through editing, I've been able to salvage a few more where it's like, we may record for 60 or 70 minutes and cut that down to 40. So it's like, okay, it was painful to listen to live where you're like, oh my God, when is this guy going to, wrap it up? And it's like, oh, we can fix that in post in a lot of cases. There's been very few where, we're just, this is not a fit. Like I had one woman on and I was like asking her, well, what would it cost you to get started? She was making like digital products for Amazon or something. And she was like, oh, it was like $100,000 for this studio and the film crew. And I was like, whoa, that's a significant, like what gave you the confidence to invest in, and she just like, well, what percentage does Amazon take? Like, she just didn't know her numbers. And it was like so frustrating. Oh, my husband handles it. Like, well, fine. This is not a fit. Let's go.
You're not the person. We need to talk to your husband.
Yeah.
I feel that same way when I get pitched by PR people and they want to do all the booking and things. And it's like, well, you're probably not going to be able to answer the questions that I'm asking on the pre-booking form. That's one of the ways that I vet. I'm glad you're talking about this. I feel like so many people don't. When you've got a successful podcast, there's a lot that goes into it. And just like anything, just like a book, a blog, or whatever. And speaking of sausage getting made, it's like we don't watch the sausage get made. We just hear the final product or view the final product. And people think it just happens. Like, oh man, Nick is so smooth. How does he get all these great guests? Well, it takes work.
The other thing that I did was create a pitch form. And this is the hard part. It's like, the 10% that are awesome. You're like, great, let's make this happen. The other 10% that are clearly not a fit, like that are awful, like that's easy. I don't even need to reply. It's like that 80% in the middle where you're like, there might be something there. Like maybe, we could massage it this way. Maybe there's a hook. Maybe there's a story. And it's like for those, it's so time consuming to try and figure out what that hook might be. Like, can I listen to you on another show? Like, what else have you done? Like to say that you can, make good radio. So I created a pitch form, sidehustlenation.com/pitch. It asks, okay, what is your proposed hook that you want to share? What are 3 things that the audience is going to take away? What are they going to learn from this? And like, where can I hear a previous interview of yours? So it's like, that has saved me so much time in just, being able to highlight stuff. And again, it kind of gives me an out for the ones where it's like, I don't love getting pitched, but if you must, like, you can go over here.
I love that. I do the same thing. And again, it's something I've never heard people talk about. I thought I was the only one doing it, honestly. I thought I was like, oh, genius. But
genius.
But I think great minds think alike like that, because a lot of getting a good interview out of people, and again, this is the foundation to building a big podcast, the 10 million downloads, is that work on the front end. It's having some kind of organization, having people show up. One of the things that I have to deal with a lot, and I'm curious if it happens to you as well, is the quality of audio. Do you have people who show up and they want to talk into like a tin can and a string?
That's always frustrating. trying to troubleshoot the technical stuff. When you can't see the other person's screen or, what they're like, is it plugged in? No. Like, is the USB plugged in? Just like, it's so painful. I normally use Zencastr to record, and it's a pretty simple interface, but it is still a challenge. I have a rotating ATR 2100 that just floats around the country, gets sent to different guests if they request it, volunteer it. If we're on a tight timeline, I can just prime one over to somebody.
How does that work though? Because we're talking about, it's not a crazy expensive mic, $60 though. There is some kind of investment. What level do you have to be at for Nick Loper to send you a mic in the mail and hope that he gets it back?
If it's somebody that you really want on the show, and to have this like kind of pre-interview, I don't know what you would call it, like a tip sheet. Like, hey, here's what the audience is into. Like, the more specific you can be. Like, if you're selling on eBay, you want to start your auctions at 5 p.m. on a Friday and run it for 7 days at 99 cents, no reserve. Like, that level of detail people love. So that's like one tidbit that's like in that tip sheet. It says, hey, we normally record through Zencastr. It works best in Chrome. If you don't have an external mic, here's one that I recommend. If your budget is tight, like, I can send you one, just like let me know. So a handful of people was like, yeah, could you send me one? No problem. And so I'll just send a note to the last guest, like, hey, would you mind dropping it in the mail this week to so-and-so, like at this address? That's worked pretty well, especially for people, because most of the people I talk to, or at least many of the interesting guests, like, I love to be the person to like scoop that story. And it's their first time being interviewed, so they don't have this set up. And so it's like, okay, here, if we can make life easy for you, especially like plug and play USB mic, that has tended to work well.
Okay, with that said, though, if you're getting first-time guests, and I'm right there with you, it's like the potential is there, but you can also find that they don't have maybe the media training or the organization. They're like, hey, is this thing on? It just doesn't work. I want to talk about the different formats, because I know that's how you handle like some of this stuff. We talked about that just a minute ago, talking about editing out certain things, taking highlights, but you've got solo podcast episodes where it's just you. And can you talk about how you organize that? Then we'll get into some of the ones that you're doing with guests.
The solo shows, man, they probably take longer than the interview shows, because even to this day, like, give me a microphone and I'm like, well, what do I say? So like probably 90% of those shows are still scripted out almost word for word. And so they take a ton of time to write, 5, 6, 7,000 words to make half an hour worth of audio. Those are fewer and farther between just because of the production time. When I do those, it's like, okay, how can I repurpose this to blog content, to YouTube content? Like, always thinking of like, well, I went through this effort to make this, like, where else, sometimes pull chapters from books and, turn that into an episode of the show.
Are you not doing bullet points at all? You don't feel comfortable yet working from an outline, and you just prefer to have it scripted? Is that...
Yeah, sometimes bullet points, but pretty detailed, pretty detailed bullet points, I'd say.
Just as a quick side note, we're going to get a little bit technical, but I'm in the middle of recording an audiobook. And are you aware of Punch and Roll? Do you know about Punch and Roll?
I don't.
Are you recording on Audacity?
Yes.
So here's what you can do if you make a mistake. This is anybody who's doing a scripted show like you're talking about, Nick, and you are going to be reading the same words. You go back to the point where you made a mistake. Just put your cursor there, and you hit Shift-D. It'll play back the last 5 seconds that you've recorded, and bam, hits record, and you are back right where you started. So it enables you not to have to go back and edit the mistakes that you're making if you make mistakes reading like I do, which, believe me,
all the time.
And so that's going to save you a lot of time on those solo episodes, because it sounds like you're putting a ton of time in if you're doing 7,000 words of scripting. That's a lot of work, man.
It's a blog post too. It's double dipping.
Let's talk about the Q&A shows. So Q&A, how does that differ from an interview, or is what you call Q&A, is that an interview?
Sure. So Q&A is audience questions for me. So I have a series called 20 Questions with Nick, and those are just like, diving into the email inbox, into the, Facebook group questions, even into like blog comment questions over the last several months, and saying, okay, what were some interesting questions that came up over that time? In email, I have a folder in Gmail that I can tag as questions, and I'll put a little star by the ones that I think might make for a good show. And so just every probably 5 months or so, we'll go in and make a show based on those. And the email ones are easy because I usually have written a response at that point, so I can turn that into audio pretty easily.
Do you ever have people send in audio clips of the questions?
Not usually. I've used SpeakPipe for a handful of kind of like Roundup style shows in the past. One was like, what's a weird productivity tip that you do? And the other one was like, tell me how you made your first side hustle income. And those were really fun. Those were, a little more challenging to put together, but it was a cool kind of like change of pace for the show, and cool to involve members of the community too. These are just, I'll read the question and then I'll read the answer.
Pretty simple, question, answer, that's the format. You do panel episodes. Explain panel episodes and also how you actually put a panel together.
So panel episodes would be 2 or more guests. We've done kind of a productivity roundtable. We've done a YouTube roundtable. We did one recently on low content publishing. Like, I'm going to write a journal, or I'm going to publish like kind of a blank diary on Amazon print on demand again. So this is again another fascinating type of business where it's like, oh, I want to get involved with publishing, but I don't want to write a book. Well, here's how you do it. Logistics wise, I'm using a software called Doodle to kind of like find a time that works for everybody. It's kind of like a voting software where it's like, okay, check the boxes of the times that work for you, and we'll schedule that. Still using Zencaster for those. I actually used Squadcast for one of those because I thought it was video, but apparently not yet. Maybe version 3.0 will have video. And then put all the audio together from those. So it's kind of like where I get the panel episodes where it's like, I'll kind of want to feature certain people, or there's maybe more than one person that I want to feature on a particular topic. Like, you're doing something interesting on YouTube. You've got a different take on this business, or you've got a different monetization strategy. Like, let's see if we can bring this together and kind of present a more holistic view than just one person.
Now, you mentioned video. Are you releasing these on YouTube as well as the audio podcast, or is that just so people can see each other and it makes recording easier?
For the low content publishing one, I had intended to do it as a YouTube first type of experiment, but just, I only got WAV files, so there was no video. For years, actually probably for the first 300 something episodes, I did syndicate the show to YouTube just with a placeholder image. And as you might expect, those videos didn't perform terribly well, or those videos. Like, sometimes you get comments like, dude, your video's not playing. I was like, yeah, it's because it's audio. But some of those, surprisingly, like, have tens of thousands of views. And even if, probably the average is like 200 views, which is like 200 incremental listeners, like, that's awesome. Right. And I'm trying to actually shifting YouTube strategy a little bit, and we're kind of recording some shorter interviews on topics that are still relevant to side hustlers, still interesting to side hustlers, but maybe not a great fit for the main show. And then using that content to kind of bolster or supplement written content on the site. For example, I talked to a guy who'd made 10 grand so far this year, delivering groceries with Instacart. It's like, fantastic plug and play side hustle. Like, he was putting the hours to make that, but like 10 grand is 10 grand, right? But those types of episodes historically have not done well on the podcast because it's like, yeah, what do I need to know? Turn on the app and, apply, and then we're good. But it's like, there was a lot of nuance to it. So we did it for YouTube, and then created the Instacart shopper review for the blog. And that's turned into a piece of content that started to rank in Google.
Yeah, it seems like with YouTube being such a big search engine, the second largest search engine, in fact, that if somebody were searching for a specific thing like Instacart, it seems like that would be a great thing, maybe better than podcasting, actually, to get that message out there.
Yeah, I'm excited for YouTube and kind of like expanding the YouTube presence, and actually kind of like taking a page out of Joe Rogan's playbook and like pulling some of these questions from the Q&A episodes and putting those up on YouTube as standalone videos. Like, hey, you may not want to listen to the full 20 questions, but like, if you're typing in something like, do I need to, register my side hustle with the Secretary of State, or like something very specific like that, like, hey, that answer might be interesting. Maybe that can be a funnel into the larger show. Like, hey, if you like this stuff, subscribe to the channel. We've got lots of different ideas on how to make extra money. Here you go.
Another format that you're doing for episodes, you do coaching episodes. Explain how that works. How do you find the people that are on there with you?
This started with me doing the coaching, and that backfired in a little ways, because like I took applications like, hey, do you want to receive a year of free coaching? And like, we're going to do this whole thing, and had a couple candidates who both kind of dropped off for different reasons. And so that was kind of an unsatisfying end to that. That was when coaching was a bigger part of my business. Like that was like, hey, I could use the podcast to get coaching clients. Fantastic. I found that one-on-one work like really stressed me out. Like that straight hours for time, or that straight like time for money kind of thing was like, I felt like you just had to have some incredible breakthrough in every session. And it just didn't happen. Like, I don't know. I didn't love doing that. So now the coaching episodes are usually someone else who has expertise in a particular area, who is a friend or colleague or somebody I'd like to feature anyways, and somebody who has, or somebody who's experiencing a challenge in that particular area. So we had a friend of mine, Kim Anderson, who's like a professional blog coach, and somebody who had started a blog like a month ago. Like, okay, here's what we would do if we were in your shoes. Or we had a recent one where it was like a productized consulting expert. So Kurt Elster is like super mastermind, like when it comes to everything Shopify marketing, optimization. And so that's like his productized service. So we talked to a guy who was like kind of a ghostwriter. Like he'd already gotten some ghostwriting clients, was trying to figure out, okay, how do I market this? How do I package this up? And so an interesting conversation on those lines. So yeah, just another, little formatting change to the arsenal.
So that right there, that is how you get 10 million podcast downloads. It's that easy.
just keep paying that hosting bill for 6 years and you'll get there.
It just does itself. It's just $15 a month and you're good. What's next for you? What do you think the next thing is? What are you jumping into that you're excited about?
Still excited about doing the show. And so I don't see that, or I don't foresee that going anywhere. What I was trying to work on this summer, two main revenue pillars for me today are sponsorships on the show and affiliate marketing through the blog and the website. So I was trying to add a third leg to that stool, which is like what everybody says to do, and especially in the online marketing space, is like you need to have an info product. You need to have a course of your own. So I went through the process, built this thing out, ran the surveys, did the pre-sales, like did all this stuff this summer for like the startmysidehustle.com course. And I've not seen amazing results. Like, so the card is closing today. So I need to send one more reminder email to the people who seem remotely interested in it. But like, I don't know, like it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be converting as well as I had maybe hoped, or maybe I just haven't got the offer right. So I think there is still an opportunity to build that third leg of the stool. Just not quite sure what shape it'll take yet.
I love that you mentioned that though, because again, people see the outside and they don't know the inside and what it takes. And of course, we're joking around about the 10 million downloads. That's how you do it. It didn't just happen. It happened because you showed up, did the work. Every week, a new episode is coming out. When things worked, you kept them up. When things didn't work, you tweaked them. And that's how success is done. It's really not unlike a side hustle. You got your guy there at the parking lot just showing up every day doing it. And at the end of the year, he's got him a 6-figure business. And people are like, how did he do it? Well, it's pretty simple. But you do have to show up and you have to do the work. And when it doesn't work, you have to tweak it so it does. I want to ask you one more question, and that is, what is something I should have asked you that you want to be known for, that you want to be known at all, that I didn't?
That's a good one. One thing that we didn't really touch on is the concept that I'll call climbing the listener pyramid. So this is something that I think is really important to the world of podcasting, in that if you imagine a pyramid, it's got 4 layers. The base layer is just like strangers, people who'd never heard of you. Next you have listeners, and you have subscribers, and you have fans at the very top. You think of like every piece of content that you create, or all your marketing activities are like designed to kind of ascend people up that pyramid. And the biggest challenge for new podcasters is like converting strangers into listeners, like that very first discovery channel, that discovery mechanism. When I started, and I believe when the Red podcast started as well, it's like, oh, it's all about new and noteworthy in iTunes. And it's like, okay, even achieving number 1 and new and noteworthy in iTunes, it was like worth like 50 downloads in a day, maybe 200. I don't know. It was like not like you're going to be instant celebrity even when you achieve that. So it's like this constant blocking and tackling, trying to convert strangers into listeners. And when I launched the show, I don't know if you have a similar story, but like I went through my Gmail archives because I had an email list of 11 people. So like, well, I don't have any audience to speak of, but I have hundreds of people who have interacted with on email over the years, and went through like letter by letter, like and seeing what Gmail, like compose suggestion would show up, like, oh, Aaron, I haven't emailed Aaron in a while. Let's see what Aaron's up to. Hey, what are you going on? Here's a project. And actually I've kind of pitched it in the first outreach, like, hey, here's something I'm working on. What I would probably do today is like, hey, what's new in the life? It's been a while, like waiting for that response to come back, because it's human nature for him to reciprocate and say, oh, I'm working on such and such, what's new with you? Like, oh, I'm glad you asked, because I actually have this new project I'm pretty excited about. Like, right. So like trying to, and it's the same is true on Amazon and Udemy and YouTube to a certain extent. Like all these different platforms are algorithm driven, and iTunes is no exception. Like if you can give the algorithm a little bit of a nudge, it tends to start working in your favor. So thinking about converting strangers into listeners into subscribers. For me, the big shift was creating episode specific lead magnets, which was like obviously a lot of work, but it was like a big turning point for the show, because it was a little over a year deep into it, had 1,000 email subscribers. So I was like, I fought tooth and nail for those 1,000 people. But within 3 months of implementing these episode specific opt-in offers or content upgrades, it was 3,000. Within 6 months, it was 6,000. It was a big inflection point for the show, and didn't seem to impact listenership either, which is one thing that I was afraid of. If I give people the text version or the summary version, like who's gonna listen to the 40 minutes of audio? Like it didn't work that way. It's like, hey, we took the notes for you. You're probably out walking the dog, at the gym, driving in your car. Like, don't worry. We took the notes for you. Here you go. You can go download them over there. So that was converting listeners into subscribers, and then subscribers into fans. I think the biggest maybe pivot point there is like once you've helped someone to the point where they saw a result. Once you have done that, like, hey, I meet people at conferences all the time who tell me, oh, I listened to your episode on Pinterest marketing, and now I'm getting 5,000 visitors a month. Now that person is a fan because like I've helped them in some meaningful way. Or I listened to your episode on merch by Amazon and sold $1,000 worth of t-shirts last month. Like, dude, that's like, that's awesome, And so now you have a fan who can help evangelize and spread the word for you.
That's a perfect way to sum it up. You talked about new and noteworthy. I mean, you can get a lot of downloads there, but the true fans, that's really what you want. And that's what's going to stick it out with you. And that's what's going to get you to 10 million. I mean, new and noteworthy will take you to 100,000. You want to get to 10 million, you got to have those true fans that are going to come back week after week after week. Well, Nick, thank you so much for being here. You give me so much. And one of the things I'm going to have to do is that I've got to do a content upgrade for this episode now. You've thrown down
your hand on that.
You've thrown down the challenge for me. So thank you so much. It's sidehustlenation.com to go read about what Nick is doing, to read about what other people are doing, but also to check out the podcast, which is Side Hustle Show. And I love this show. I wrote about it in my book, Big Podcast. It's so great. And what you're doing is so inspirational. You're helping a lot of people. So thanks for being here on Red.
Well, very much appreciate you having me, and let's not wait another 4 years to catch up.
Nick Loper on Red Podcast. Speaking of podcasts, check out the podcast. It's the same name as the site, Side Hustle Nation. Search for it in your favorite podcast player. And while you're adding to your podcast subscriptions, subscribe to Red. Make sure you never miss an episode. Go to bigpodcast.com. That's bigpodcast.com/subscribe. You will see Red. You'll know it because the artwork is red, just like a stop sign. You'll see all the other podcasts that I have to help you grow an audience, build something around your message, and make more money spreading that message to people and helping them. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. And I will see you on the next episode of Red Podcast.